The morning Orville Sawyer sold his horse was the morning he decided he was done with everything that had ever mattered to him. He stood at the edge of the livery stable in Dusty Creek, Texas, in the autumn of 1878, watching old Cal Henders lead the buckskin stallion away. And he did not cry because he had run out of tears somewhere between burying his wife and watching the bank foreclose on the ranch his father had built with bare and bleeding hands. He simply stood there with $40 in his coat pocket, $40 for a horse worth twice that, and told himself it did not matter. He had been telling himself a lot of things did not matter lately. He was 31 years old and he felt ancient. Dusty Creek was a town that clung to the edge of West Texas like a burr on a saddle blanket, stubborn and uncomfortable and not quite sure why it was still there. It had a main street of packed red dirt, a general store, a saloon called the Copper Nail, a sheriff's office, a church that leaned slightly to the left, and a stage depot that smelled of horse sweat and old leather. The population numbered somewhere around 200 souls, depending on the week, and most of those souls minded their own business with the particular dedication of people who had seen enough of other people's trouble. Orville was not originally from Dusty Creek. He had come down from the hill country near San Antonio 6 years ago with his wife, Clara, and a dream of running cattle. For 3 years the dream had held. Then the drought came, and after the drought came the fever, and after the fever came the silence of a house where a woman used to hum while she cooked, and after the silence came the debt, and after the debt came the men from the bank with their polished boots and their papers, and after the papers came the emptiness. He had said goodbye to the ranch. He had said goodbye to the cattle. He had said goodbye to the dog, a red hound named Pepper, who had gone to live with the widow Mackey on the edge of town. He had said goodbye to Clara's grave, which sat under a mesquite tree on what was no longer his land, which was perhaps the hardest goodbye of all. And he had, just this morning, said goodbye to the horse. He was living in a rented room above the general store, doing odd jobs, and he had a plan. It was not a good plan, but it was a plan. He was going to take his $40, get on the next stage west to El Paso, and from there figure out something that looked like a future. Maybe work on someone else's ranch. Maybe keep moving until the weight in his chest either dissolved or killed him outright. He was not particular about which. He was, in short, a man who had practiced saying goodbye so many times that he had begun to feel goodbye was the only word he still knew how to say with any real conviction. The stage from Abilene arrived on a Thursday. Orville was sitting on the bench outside the general store, whittling nothing in particular, when he heard it come in. He did not look up immediately because stages came and went, and he had no reason to care. He heard the driver holler at the horses, heard the creak of the brake, heard the particular groan of the stage door swinging open. He heard boots hitting the dirt. He heard a woman's voice say, "Thank you," to the driver with the kind of quiet steadiness that makes a person look up even when they have decided not to care about anything. He looked up. She was not what he expected, though he had not expected anything. She was somewhere around 26, he guessed, with dark hair that had been pinned up with a stubbornness that suggested several miles of road had done their best to undo it and only partially succeeded. She wore a traveling dress of dark green wool that was dusty at the hem, but had been well made once. She had a trunk, a carpet bag, and an expression on her face that Orville recognized because he had worn it himself, the expression of someone who has come to a new place not out of hope exactly, but out of necessity, and who is trying to decide whether those two things are different enough to matter. She stood in the street and looked at Dusty Creek for a long, quiet moment. Then she squared her shoulders and picked up her carpet bag. Orville looked back down at his whittling. He had not felt anything looking at her. That was what he told himself. Nothing but the mild curiosity of a man with nothing better to do. Her name, he would learn eventually, was Pearl Hawthorne. She had come from Abilene, before that from a small town in eastern Tennessee, and before that from a life that had, in its own way, taught her as many goodbyes as his had, though of a different kind. She was not a widow. She was, instead, a woman who had spent 4 years nursing an ailing father while the world moved on without her, and who had arrived in Dusty Creek in response to an advertisement placed in the Abilene Gazette by a rancher named Douglas Firth who was looking for a school teacher. She had a teaching certificate from the state of Tennessee. She had $12.30. She had a letter from Douglas Firth promising room and board at the schoolteacher's cottage on the edge of town, and a salary of $20 a month. She did not know, as she stood in the street outside the stage depot, that Douglas Firth had died of a heart attack 2 weeks prior, that the letter she carried was therefore somewhat less than binding, and that the schoolteacher's cottage had already been requisitioned by Firth's brother-in-law for use as a grain storage shed. She would find all of this out within the next 20 minutes. Orville heard the whole thing from his bench, because in a town of 200 people nothing happened in anything like privacy. He heard her asking at the stage depot for Douglas Firth, heard the depot clerk, a thin young man named Ben Pryor, explain about the heart attack with the particular combination of regret and relish that small towns reserve for bad news. He heard her ask about the cottage. He heard Ben Pryor explain about the grain shed. He saw her face, when he glanced up, go through a sequence of expressions: surprise, dismay, something that might have been anger briefly, and then a carefully arranged composure that he recognized as the face of a person deciding to hold themselves together in public no matter what. She stood there for a moment with her carpet bag in her hand and her trunk at her feet, and she said calmly, "Is there somewhere in this town I might inquire about lodging?" "Ma'am," said Ben Pryor, "you could try the widow Mackey. She takes in boarders sometimes." "Thank you," Pearl Hawthorne said, in exactly the same tone she had used with the stage driver. She picked up her carpet bag. She looked at the trunk. She looked at the distance down the street to where the widow Mackey lived, which was at least a quarter-mile. She set down the carpet bag. She looked at the trunk again. Orville was on his feet before he had made any conscious decision to be. He heard himself say, "I can carry that for you," and he was already crossing the street before he had finished the sentence. She looked at him. He stopped a polite distance away and removed his hat, which was brown and well-worn, and had a crease in the brim from 1,000 times of being grabbed in a hurry. He was a tall man, lean in the way that hard work and harder years make a person lean, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes that were a particular shade of gray-green that changed with the light. He had the hands of a man who had worked cattle, and a face that had once been open and easy to read, and was now held at a careful reserve. "Orville Sawyer," he said. "I am heading that direction anyway." This was not entirely true. He had no particular direction he was heading, but it was close enough. Pearl Hawthorne looked at him for a moment with eyes that were dark brown and rather direct, the eyes of a woman who had learned to take the measure of strangers quickly. Then she said, "Pearl Hawthorne, and I would appreciate it." He picked up the trunk. It was heavier than it looked. He did not comment on this. They walked down the main street of Dusty Creek in the October sunshine. And because they were walking, and because it felt more awkward to say nothing than to say something, Orville said, "You the new school teacher?" "I was supposed to be," she said. "Mr. Firth's situation has complicated that somewhat." "He was a decent man," Orville said, because Douglas Firth had in fact been decent to him once when he was in a bad season and he believed in saying true things. "Did you know him well?" "Well enough." He shifted the trunk slightly on his shoulder. "You have family somewhere waiting on news of you." She was quiet for a moment. "My father died 3 months ago. I am afraid the news of my situation is entirely my own." "I am sorry for your loss," he said, and he meant it with the full weight of a man who understood exactly what it felt like to be the only one left. She glanced at him sideways. "And you, Mr. Sawyer family?" "No," he said, "not anymore." He said it plainly, without invitation for further question, and she accepted the plainness of it with a nod which he appreciated. A lot of people pushed at that kind of answer. She did not. They reached the widow Mackey's house, a white-painted structure of 2 stories with a porch that had seen better decades. The widow herself was a stout woman of 60 or so with silver hair and an expression of permanent mild suspicion that she applied equally to strangers and people she had known for years. When Pearl explained her situation, calmly, clearly, without self-pity, the widow Mackey studied her for a long moment and then said she had a room on the second floor, meals included, for $8 a month, which was a fair price and possibly even a generous one considering. Pearl said she would take it. Orville set the trunk down in the entry hall. "Thank you, Mr. Sawyer," Pearl said. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and put his hat back on and walked back out into the street. He did not think about her again for the rest of the day. He was very deliberate about this. It worked until about 9 in the evening, when he was lying on his cot in the room above the general store staring at the ceiling and thinking about El Paso, and he found himself wondering whether she had eaten supper and whether the widow Mackey's cooking was as dreadful as rumor suggested, and then he made himself stop and think about the stage schedule instead. He thought he would be on the next stage west. He had said goodbye to this town. He had said it in his head, if not out loud. The trouble was that the next stage did not depart until the following Thursday. By Tuesday, Orville Sawyer had carried Pearl Hawthorne's groceries from the general store twice, fixed the latch on the widow Mackey's gate when Pearl mentioned it was broken, and learned that she took her coffee without sugar and that she laughed differently than he expected. Not the polite small laugh of someone being careful, but a real one, sudden and warm, that she seemed slightly surprised by herself. This was worrying. The situation with the school was complicated. Douglas Firth had been the chairman of the town's small school board, and with his death, everything had fallen into administrative uncertainty. The school itself was a one-room building at the east end of town that had been closed since the previous spring when the last teacher, a young man from Ohio, had gotten married and moved to Dallas. There were 11 children in Dusty Creek between the ages of 5 and 14 who were currently receiving their education either from their mothers, from old almanacs, or from nothing at all, depending on the household. Pearl Hawthorne did not sit and wait for the school board to sort itself out. On her second full day in Dusty Creek, she walked to the school building, inspected it, found it dirty and disorganized but structurally sound, walked back to the general store, bought cleaning supplies on credit that she negotiated with the owner, a round man named Herman Jost, with a calm competence that impressed him enough to agree, and then she cleaned the school. She cleaned it thoroughly. It took all of Tuesday and most of Wednesday. On Thursday morning, which was also the day of the stage west, Orville was sitting on his bench again with his bag packed and his ticket in his pocket, watching the stage being prepared. He was not looking toward the school. He was thinking about El Paso and the future, which was a word that had started to feel strange in his mouth, like a word in a foreign language he had once known and since forgotten. He heard Herman Jost say, behind him, "That schoolteacher woman got the Aldrich brothers to agree to a school meeting Friday evening. Danielle Reyes is putting up a notice. You see her talking to the sheriff about getting official sanction." "I hadn't," said the man Jost was talking to, who was the blacksmith, a large, quiet man named Ford Elkins. "She walked right in there like she owned the office," Jost said, not unkindly. "Lester damn near fell off his chair." Ford Elkins laughed, a low, rumbling sound. "Good for her." Orville looked at the stage. He looked at his ticket. He thought about a woman who had arrived in a broken situation and had spent 2 days cleaning a school building on credit and talking to sheriffs, and he thought about the particular expression on her face when she had squared her shoulders in the street that first day, and he thought about the fact that she had laughed in a way she seemed surprised by herself, and he thought about El Paso. He put the ticket in his coat pocket. He did not get on the stage. He told himself he was staying because he needed another week to settle a small debt with Herman Jost, which was true in the sense that the debt existed, though he had already arranged to settle it before leaving. He told himself this, and he mostly believed it for about 3 days. The school meeting on Friday evening was held in the church, which was the largest gathering space in Dusty Creek, and sat about 60 people uncomfortably. 37 people came, which was a remarkable showing for a weekday evening, and said something about the collective interest in seeing how the new woman would handle herself. She handled herself well. Orville had not intended to go to the meeting. He went because Ford Elkins asked him, and Orville liked Ford Elkins, and going to the meeting was something to do besides sit in his room and have arguments with himself about stages. Pearl stood at the front of the church with her teaching certificate and her list of curriculum and her particular brand of quiet authority, and spoke to those 37 people, as though she had been speaking to rooms full of skeptical strangers her whole life, which in a sense she had been. She answered questions directly. When a rancher named Amos Gruder asked whether a woman from Tennessee could really teach Texas children anything worthwhile, she said, evenly, "The alphabet is the same in both states, Mr. Gruder, and I am happy to let your children's progress answer the question for me in 3 months' time." Several people laughed. Amos Gruder looked like he wanted to argue but could not quite find the right angle. The board, which had reconstituted itself with some emergency shuffling, voted to hire her. $20 a month, the cottage, once the grain was moved, which would happen the following week, and the use of the school building. When it was over and people were filing out into the cool October night, Orville found himself in the church doorway at the same time as Pearl. The crowd pushed them gently together, and for a moment they were standing very close, and he could see that she was holding herself very still in the way of someone who has just released a great deal of tension and is trying not to let it show. "Congratulations," he said. "You got the position." She exhaled. "I suppose I did." She looked up at him, and in the lantern light from the doorway her eyes were warm and dark, and there was something in them that was not yet happiness but was perhaps the possibility of it. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Sawyer." It was I appreciated having a familiar face in the room. He registered that he had become, in 4 days, a familiar face. He noted this the way you note something you will want to think about later. "You argued it well," he said. "I had to," she said simply. There was no alternative. He walked her back to the widow Mackey's house. He had not planned to. It happened the way a lot of things were beginning to happen around Pearl Hawthorne, as a consequence of proximity and something he could not quite name. They walked in the October dark, and she asked him about Dusty Creek, what it was really like, the parts that did not show in a school board meeting. He told her honestly the drought cycles, the disputes between ranchers and the small farmers who were beginning to come in, the periodic trouble with outlaws on the roads between towns, the way the town was at a kind of crossroads between the old way of things and something newer, and how nobody was entirely sure which way it was going to go. She listened carefully, the way she seemed to do everything. "And you?" she asked. "What are you doing in Dusty Creek, Mr. Sawyer?" "Passing through," he said. "You said you were heading in my direction the first day we met, and it has been 4 days since then." He was silent for a moment. "I was delayed." She glanced at him with a look that said she did not entirely believe this but was too polite to say so directly. "I see." They reached the widow Mackey's gate. The latch he had fixed held solid when she opened it. "Good night, Mr. Sawyer," she said. "Good night, Miss Hawthorne." He walked back through the dark streets of Dusty Creek and stood in the middle of the main road for a moment looking up at the stars, which were thick and brilliant in the West Texas sky. And he thought about the fact that he had practiced leaving this town for 2 weeks now and had not managed it, and he thought about what that meant, and he thought about Clara. He thought about Clara for a long time. He thought about her the way he had learned to think about her, not with the acute, tearing grief of the early months, but with a different kind of feeling, more like the ache of a healed bone that still remembers the break. He thought about how she had laughed differently than Pearl, but just as real, and about how she would have told him, in her practical way, that a man standing in the middle of a road staring at stars was a man avoiding an obvious truth. He thought that she was probably right. He had not planned to feel anything again. He had said goodbye to that too. He had, it appeared, said that goodbye prematurely. October wore into November, and November in West Texas could be warm in the afternoons and cold enough to crack the earth at night, and Orville Sawyer did not leave Dusty Creek. He stopped pretending he was about to. He found work. He had thought work would be hard to find, but Ford Elkins needed a man at the smithy for heavy work, at least through the winter, and Orville had always been good with horses and useful with his hands, and the pay was modest but sufficient. He took the job with the understanding on both sides that it was temporary, and within 2 weeks he had stopped thinking of it as temporary and Ford Elkins had stopped suggesting it, and neither of them mentioned this transition out loud. He and Pearl fell into a rhythm that neither of them had arranged. Dusty Creek was a small place, and small places create proximity, and proximity, given enough time, creates familiarity, and familiarity between the right two people begins to take on its own warmth. He saw her most mornings going to the school, her books under her arm, her dark hair pinned with more success than that first day, her green wool dress replaced as the weather turned by a heavier coat of dark brown that had been her father's, altered to fit her, and somehow this, the wearing of her father's altered coat, told him more about Pearl Hawthorne than anything she had said directly. She had moved into the cottage, once the grain was relocated, and he had helped with this because Ford Elkins had the wagon and Orville had the morning free. The cottage was small and needed work, but was structurally better than it appeared from outside, which turned out to be a thing he had in common with the cottage in that both of them had held together through damage that should have broken them. He fixed the window frame on the cottage's north side one Saturday morning in November while she was at the school. He did not ask permission. He just did it. He left no note. He was not sure what he would have written. She found out it was him because Dusty Creek had 200 people and no secrets. She came to the smithy on Monday afternoon and stood in the open doorway until he looked up from the horse he was tending, which was a big gray mare belonging to the Aldrich brothers' ranch, and she said, "You fixed my window." "It was letting in the cold," he said. "You fixed it without asking." "I had the time," he said. "I should have asked. I apologize." She looked at him for a moment. "No," she said slowly, "I think what I mean to say is thank you. I only stated it the other way first because it surprised me. Didn't mean to surprise you." "You do it somewhat regularly," she said, and something in her voice was different, lighter almost, with a thread of something that might have been the precursor to warmth. "For a man who says he is passing through." He looked at her. She looked at him. They were standing in the warm, dusty smell of the smithy, with the gray mare shifting between them and the afternoon light coming in at a low angle through the wide door. He said, "I may have revised my plans somewhat." Pearl Hawthorne tilted her head very slightly and said, "I am glad to hear it," and turned and walked back toward the school. And Orville Sawyer stood in the smithy doorway watching her go, and then went back to the gray mare with the feeling of a man who has just realized that the word he has been searching for is not goodbye at all. The first real cold front of the season blew through Dusty Creek in the second week of November, rattling windows and sending people to their hearths, and it was on the evening of that cold front that Orville discovered Pearl Hawthorne had been carrying a heavier load than she had let anyone see. It happened because of a child. One of her students, a boy of 8 named Tommy Reyes, son of Danielle Reyes, who had posted the school meeting notice, had not come to school for 2 days, and when Pearl went to check on him, she found that the Reyes household was in a bad state. Danielle Reyes had been ill for a week. There was almost no food, and the 2 younger children were frightened and cold. Pearl had gone back to her cottage, gotten her own flour and salt pork and coffee, brought it to the Reyes house, made a meal, made sure the children were warm, and then sat with Danielle until the woman was settled. She had then gone to the widow Mackey to ask about getting a doctor and had been told Dr. Marsh was out to the Aldrich ranch and would not be back until morning. She had then gone to the church to find the Reverend, who was not in. She had then walked to the sheriff's office, not to report a crime, but because Sheriff Lester Morrison was 55 and had lived in Dusty Creek for 30 years and knew everyone and their circumstances, and Pearl Hawthorne was a woman who, when she needed to solve a problem, went directly to the best available source of information. This was where Orville found her when he came to the sheriff's office to drop off a bit of leather work. The sheriff had asked Ford Elkins about a small repair on a saddle. He found her and Sheriff Morrison deep in conversation about what resources the town had for people in need, and he found Morrison looking slightly overwhelmed, because he was a man used to problems that involved horses and guns, and not the particular kind of quiet emergency that was happening in the Ray's household. Orville said, "What is needed?" Pearl turned and looked at him. There was something in her face that was different from the composed, organized woman of the school meeting, and the cottage and the Monday afternoon in the smithy, something tired, and something that was trying very hard not to be frightened. "Danielle Reyes needs a doctor by morning," Pearl said. "I believe she has a fever that is worsening. The children are all right for tonight, but they need someone to check on them." "I can sit with the Reyes children tonight," Orville said. "I have done that kind of thing before." He said this plainly, without elaboration, and Pearl heard the plainness of it and seemed to understand that there was a before in it that cost him something to say. She nodded. "I will stay with Danielle." "You don't need to stay the night alone with her. I can send for Mrs. Jost." "Mrs. Jost," Pearl said, "has 3 children of her own, and Herman is away buying stock in Abilene. I will be fine. I have sat with sick people before." He knew she meant her father, though she did not say so. He recognized the particular matter-of-fact courage of someone who has learned to do hard things alone. "All right," he said, "but leave the door unlocked, and if anything changes, you come get me." She looked at him for a moment, just looked at him, and he thought that she was deciding something. Then she said, "All right, Mr. Sawyer." He spent the night on a hard chair in the Ray's kitchen, with the 3 Ray's children asleep in the next room, and he read to them from a Bible he found on the shelf when Tommy woke up scared at midnight, and he made oatmeal in the morning when Dr. Marsh arrived and declared Danielle Reyes to have a bad but manageable chest infection. He made enough oatmeal for Pearl, too, and she ate it standing at the stove looking like she had not slept. And they did not talk much, but it was the silence of 2 people who have been through something together, and it was different from the silence of strangers. Walking back to the smithy that morning, Orville thought about how he had spent the night in a stranger's kitchen reading to frightened children, and how he had not thought once about El Paso, and how the weight in his chest, the weight that had been there since Clara died, since the ranch was gone, since he had become a man who had nothing left to say goodbye to, had shifted. It had not gone, but it had shifted, the way a stone shifts when water has worked at it long enough. He started calling her Pearl in early December, not because he made a decision to, but because it happened the way other things had happened, gradually, naturally, like weather. She had started calling him Orville around the same time. They ate Sunday dinners together at the Widow Mackey's, because the widow had decided that Pearl needed proper feeding and Orville needed human company, and the Widow Mackey, for all her permanent mild suspicion, had a gift for cooking that entirely disproved Herman Jost's rumored assessment. The dinners began as a courtesy. Pearl was the widow's boarder, and Orville had fixed 3 things in the widow's house by this point, and became, without any particular announcement, something else. They talked at those dinners, properly, the kind of talking that goes past pleasantries and into the actual territory of who a person is. He told her about the ranch, not the loss of it, not directly, but about what it had been like, the particular satisfaction of working land and knowing it was yours, the smell of the morning on cattle country, the sound of a windmill in the dry wind. He told her about his father, who had been a quiet man with enormous capacity for patience, who had taught him that the land does not care about your feelings, but if you treat it well, it will work with you. He did not yet tell her about Clara. She told him about Tennessee, about the town she had grown up in, about the school where she had gotten her certificate, about her father, a schoolteacher himself as it happened, a man of books and mild manners who had been entirely unprepared for the series of small disasters that had constituted his final years. She told it without bitterness, but he could hear underneath it the life she had postponed, the things she had not done because she had been needed where she was, and he understood this in a way that did not need explaining. "Why Texas?" he asked one Sunday in December when the wind was up and the windows were rattling and they were sitting at the widow's table with coffee after the meal. "Of all the places you might have gone." "The advertisement paid better than the others," I answered, she said honestly. "And I had never been. I thought," she paused, "I thought a new place was more likely to become something, rather than remaining what it already was. What it already was being a place where people knew you as the schoolteacher's grieving daughter." She looked at him. "Yes," she said, "exactly that. There is something in starting over," he said. He was quiet for a moment. "Though I have found it is harder than it looks in the planning. Because you cannot actually start over," she said. "You just start in a new place with the same self. That is about right. But the new place helps," she said, and there was something in her voice that was warmer than philosophical, something specific and present tense, something that was about here and now and possibly about him. He looked at his coffee cup. He had the words in some form. He had been finding them slowly, the way you find things in a dark room carefully, by touch. He knew he felt something for Pearl Hawthorne that had been growing since October and was now in December, something substantial and real that he could no longer pretend was mild curiosity. He knew that when she laughed the real laugh, the surprised one, something in him that had been clenched for 2 years loosened slightly. He knew that when she was not there he was aware of her absence the way you are aware of a sound that has stopped. He knew all this. But he had also, in the depths of that long silent year of grieving, made a kind of private agreement with himself. An agreement that had felt like wisdom at the time, which was that he was done. Done with caring about things that could be taken. Done with wanting. Done with the particular vulnerability of loving someone in a world where the world could take them. He had not found the words to break that agreement with himself yet, because the words for breaking a promise you made to yourself in grief are among the hardest words a person can find. December deepened, and the first Christmas without her father approached for Pearl, and Orville watched her be brave about it with the steady, quiet competence she applied to most things, and it cost him something to watch because bravery is most visible when you know what it is covering. The school closed for the Christmas week. The children of Dusty Creek, including Tommy Ray's, who was back in class and thriving, and the youngest Aldrich boy, and 7 others had put on a small performance at the church on the Friday before Christmas, reciting poetry and singing, and Pearl had organized it with a warmth that had made even Amos Gruder admit to his wife that the woman knew what she was doing. Orville had been in the church for the performance because it would have been strange not to be. He had stood at the back. He was not a man who took chairs when children could use them, and watched Pearl at the front of the church guiding her students through their recitations. And he had thought, standing there, that she was the most genuinely good person he had met since Clara, and that this thought was both a comfort and a terror. After the performance, the town gathered in the churchyard around a fire, and there was cider and someone had brought a fiddle, and the evening became the kind of uncomplicated warmth that small western towns managed on good nights, when everyone remembered they were neighbors. Orville found himself standing next to Pearl with a cup of cider in the firelight, and she was flushed with the success of the evening and the cold air, and she looked different than usual, younger somehow, or maybe just less armored, the way people get when they have done something they are genuinely proud of. "Your students did well," he said. "They did splendidly," she said with feeling. "Tommy Ray's recited all 12 lines of that poem without a single stumble. 2 weeks ago he did not believe he could do it. You believed he could." "Yes," she said simply, "because I could see that he was capable. Sometimes that is all children need, someone to see it first so they have time to catch up to the seeing." He was quiet for a moment. The fiddle started up somewhere in the dark. The fire crackled. He said, "I think that might be all most people need." She turned and looked at him. They were standing close together in the way of 2 people who have been standing close together long enough that it feels natural. And in the firelight, her dark eyes were very warm, and he was very aware that he had practiced, in his own silent way, the words he needed to say to her, not the specific sentences but the general truth of them. And that now, standing here, with the fiddle playing and the fire between them and the cold pressing in from the dark, he could not find those practiced words at all. He looked at her, she looked at him. She said quietly, "Orville," and he said, "I know," which was not the practiced words but was truer than they would have been anyway. She took his hand. Just that, took his hand with hers in the dark beside the fire, and held it, and they stood there with the music and the firelight and the cold, clear Texas sky, and the weight in his chest shifted again, further this time, like a stone that has been worked loose and is tipping toward water. He held her hand and thought about Clara, the way you can think about someone you loved and lost while also being entirely present in a different moment with a different person, which is one of the true and complicated things about the human heart that nobody talks about enough. He thought about Clara, and then he thought about Pearl, here and warm and real beside him, and he thought that Clara had always had a practical streak, and that she would have told him, not unkindly, that standing in the dark at a Christmas party holding a woman's hand and thinking about the dead was its own kind of avoidance. He squeezed Pearl's hand. She squeezed back. That was the beginning, and they both knew it. Christmas itself was quiet. Pearl spent the morning at the church service and the afternoon at the widow Mackey's table, and Orville was there too, and the widow had cooked an extraordinary meal for the three of them, which seemed to be her primary love language, and they ate and talked, and it was the warmest Christmas Orville had spent in 3 years, which was not a very high bar, but it counted. He gave Pearl a book. He had ordered it from Abilene, a collected volume of poems by Longfellow, which he had chosen after a conversation weeks ago in which she had mentioned Longfellow while talking about her father's books. He had wrapped it in brown paper and tied it with a bit of string from the smithy, and he gave it to her after dinner with a small ceremony of awkwardness that she seemed to find endearing rather than ridiculous. She opened it. She looked at the cover. She ran her thumb over the name and looked up at him and said, "Orville, when did you—" and then stopped. Her voice had done something. She cleared her throat and said, "Thank you." He said, "You mentioned it once." "I know I did," she said. "That is what I am thinking about." She had gotten him a pair of good leather gloves which she had made herself over the past several weeks, a fact he discovered when he turned one over and saw the interior stitching. He looked at the gloves for a moment and then looked at her and said, "Pearl, your hands were cold," she said practically. "I saw you working in the smithy with those inadequate things you were wearing. You observed my gloves." "I am an observant person," she said, and the corner of her mouth turned up. He thought he might be in love with her, but the thought was so large and so strange, so different from the person he had decided to be, that he set it aside carefully, like something fragile. January came in cold and hard, and Orville and Pearl came in with it. He had taken, by January, to walking her to the school in the mornings, which was not a necessity. The school was not far from the cottage, but which had become habit, and habit in the two of them had a way of becoming something more intentional without either of them calling attention to the transition. He would stop at the cottage with 2 cups of coffee from the pot he kept at the smithy. Ford Elkins had a good setup and did not mind, and they would walk the short distance to the school while the morning was still cold and clear, and they would talk. They talked about everything. That was the remarkable thing. He had not known, before Pearl, how much he had missed talking. He had always been more of a listener, or had thought of himself that way. But she asked questions that drew him out, not prying questions, but the kind that come from genuine interest, the kind that say, "I want to know what you think, specifically you, and nobody else's version." They talked about the town, about the students, about books, about Texas, about the territories further west and what was happening there, about the continuing changes in the cattle trade, about whether the railroad would come to Dusty Creek in their lifetimes and what it would mean if it did. They talked about things that happened in the newspapers that came to town 2 weeks late from San Antonio. They talked about things that had no category. He told her about Clara in January, one cold, clear morning when they were walking to the school, and he had, without planning to, mentioned something she had once said about horses, and Pearl had asked gently who had said that, and he had said, "My wife." And then, because it had been said and Pearl was Pearl, he told her. Not everything at once, but the shape of it, how they had met, what the ranch had been like in the good years, what the drought had done, what the fever had been, what the silence after was. Pearl walked beside him and listened, and she did not rush him or redirect him or do any of the things people sometimes did with grief, which was try to move it towards something more comfortable. She just listened, and when he was done she said, "She sounds like someone who knew her own mind." "She did," he said. "She always did. I think you must have liked that about her." "I did," he said, with something that was close to a smile and felt natural rather than forced, which was different. "I like that in general." Pearl said nothing, but her expression, he caught it sideways, was the quiet, careful expression of someone who has just registered something. They reached the school. She took her books from under his arm. He had been carrying them without thinking, another habit, and she looked up at him in the cold morning light and said, "Thank you, Orville, for telling me," he said. "Thank you for listening the way you do." She went into the school. He walked back to the smithy, and Ford Elkins looked at his face and said nothing at all, which was one of the things Orville appreciated most about Ford Elkins. In February there was trouble. It came in the form of two men who rode into Dusty Creek on a Wednesday afternoon and took a room at the single boarding house, not the Widow Mackey's, but the other one, run by a man named Pete Scholl, and who were, according to the collective and rapidly circulating opinion of Dusty Creek, not entirely what they presented themselves to be. They presented themselves as cattle buyers looking at stock in the area. They had good horses and good guns, and they paid in cash, and they asked a lot of questions about the road north to Sweetwater. Sheriff Morrison was not alarmed, because cattle buyers were not uncommon, and two men with good horses and questions about roads was not a crime. But he was watchful. Orville's concern was more specific. He had heard, through Ford Elkins, who heard it from a rider passing through from Sweetwater, that there had been a robbery on the road between Sweetwater and Abilene the previous week. A stage robbery, two men, nobody hurt but the strongbox missing. The description of the two men, as it filtered through the passing rider's account, bore a passing resemblance to the men currently asking about that same road from the other end. He told Sheriff Morrison. Morrison took this seriously. He sent a wire to the sheriff in Sweetwater. He told Orville to say nothing to anyone else, which Orville agreed to, and he went to speak to Pete Scholl about keeping an eye. The trouble was that Pearl, entirely unaware of any of this, had accepted a commission from the school board to pick up a shipment of books and supplies that had arrived by stage from San Antonio and were waiting at the Sweetwater depot, because the direct route from San Antonio had bypassed Dusty Creek. The board had arranged for her to go with one of the Aldrich hands on the Saturday morning stage. Orville found out about this Thursday evening when Pearl mentioned it at dinner at the Widow Mackey's. He did not say anything immediately because he had promised Morrison to say nothing, but Friday morning he went to Morrison's office before the sheriff had finished his first coffee and laid it out plainly. "She cannot go to Sweetwater on that road Saturday," he said. "Not until you hear back from their sheriff and you know whether those two men are who I think they are." Morrison frowned. "I don't have any reason to stop her. I don't have confirmation yet." "I know that," Orville said. "Which is why I am going with her." Morrison looked at him over his coffee cup. "You sweet on that schoolteacher, Sawyer. I want her to arrive in Sweetwater and come back safely," Orville said. "That is my current position." Morrison's mouth moved slightly. "The Aldrich hand going with her is young Billy Prout, who is 19 and has the situational awareness of a fence post. I know. I cannot officially ask you to. I am not asking you to ask me officially," Orville said. "I am telling you what I am doing." He told Pearl he was coming to Sweetwater with her. She raised an eyebrow and said, "You do not trust Billy Prout." "Billy Prout is 19 years old," Orville said. "That is not an answer." "It is the beginning of one," he said. He looked at her steadily. "Please let me come." She studied his face for a moment. She was a perceptive woman, and she could see that there was something beneath the simple statement, something that had to do with caution he was not at liberty to explain. She said, "All right, Orville." The ride to Sweetwater was uneventful. The two suspicious men, it turned out, had left Dusty Creek Friday evening, apparently having gathered whatever information they were gathering. Morrison received confirmation from the Sweetwater sheriff on Friday afternoon that the two men were in fact wanted for the stage robbery, but by then they were gone north, which was someone else's problem and ultimately became just that. They were picked up outside of Abilene the following week. None of this made the road feel any less cold and gray that Saturday morning, or made the warmth of sitting close to Pearl in the stage any less notable, or changed the fact that somewhere around the midpoint of the journey, when the winter prairie was flat and brown and enormous around them, and Billy Prout was asleep across from them with his hat over his face, Pearl leaned her head against Orville's shoulder, and he sat very still because he did not want her to move. She did not move. He thought about the word goodbye. He thought about how he had said it to everything: the ranch, the cattle, the dog, the horse, the grave, this town in the abstract, the future in general, and the possibility of loving anyone or anything again. He thought about how he had stood in the October Street watching a stage arrive and told himself he felt nothing, and he thought about how much practice it had taken to get that good at lying to himself. She was warm and real against his shoulder, and the prairie moved past the stage window, and he thought, "I am not saying goodbye to this." He did not say it out loud. Not yet. But he thought it with the full weight of a man who means what he thinks. They collected the books and supplies in Sweetwater and came back in the afternoon, and the day was a good day. And Billy Prout woke up on the return journey and was perfectly pleasant. And Pearl and Orville and Billy ate at the Sweetwater Hotel's small dining room, and it was the kind of ordinary warm afternoon that becomes extraordinary in memory. Coming back into Dusty Creek in the evening, with the school supplies in the back of the wagon they had arranged for the return trip and Pearl sitting beside him on the seat, she said, "Orville, why did you really come today?" He had been thinking about how to answer this for several hours. He said, "Because I did not want anything to happen to you. Because of the general hazard of the road. Because of you specifically," he said. "Because if something happened to you it would matter to me in a way that—" He stopped. The wagon rolled through the dusk toward the lights of Dusty Creek. He tried again. "I have spent a long time being careful not to care about things. I told myself it was wisdom. I think it might have been cowardice." Pearl was quiet for a moment. Then she said softly, "What changed?" "You showed up," he said, "and I could not—" He paused. The words he had practiced, or the nearest he had come to practicing them, the well-meaning internal speeches he had given himself about how he was not ready, about Clara, about the goodbye he had made to this kind of feeling, none of them came. They had all gone like smoke in a wind, and what was left was simply true. I could not keep saying goodbye to things. She turned and looked at him in the near dark, the last of the winter light catching her face, and he looked back, and they looked at each other for a long moment that was full of everything they had been not quite saying since October. "I am glad," she said. He reached over and took her hand. His new gloves were on his hands, her gloves, her stitching, and she was wearing her father's coat, and they drove into Dusty Creek together through the cold February evening, and it was not a speech or a poem, but it was the truest thing that had happened to him in years. He kissed her for the first time in March. It happened at her cottage, on a Saturday afternoon when he had come to help her repair a shelf that had finally given way under the weight of the Longfellow and the subsequent books she had acquired. And they had fixed the shelf, and then stood back to look at it with the mutual satisfaction of two people who have made a thing work. And she had looked up at him, and he had looked at her, and then he had kissed her, and she had kissed him back. And the afternoon light came through the window she had put a plant in. She had gotten a small cactus from somewhere, which suited the window and also suited Pearl in some essential way. And it was quiet and warm, and it felt, to Orville Sawyer, like The end of a very long winter. After a moment she put her hand on his face gently and looked at him with those dark, direct eyes, and she said, "I was beginning to think you never would. I was working up to it." "You had been working up to it since October," she said. "That is accurate." She laughed, the real laugh, the sudden surprised one, and he thought he would happily spend the rest of his life doing things that produced that laugh. Spring came to West Texas with the particular violence of West Texas springs, sudden and warm, and filled with wind that carried the smell of things beginning again. The prairie around Dusty Creek turned briefly, brilliantly green, and the children at the school were nearly impossible to keep indoors, and Pearl managed them with the same combination of authority and genuine affection she managed everything. Orville had a conversation with Ford Elkins in April that had been building for some time. "There is a piece of land north of town," Ford said, not looking up from the bellows he was working. "Belongs to old Reeves. He is thinking of selling. About 80 acres with a creek on the east side." Orville was silent for a moment. "I know the land. Good running land," Ford said. "Not too big, not too small." "I noticed." Ford worked the bellows. "And thinking of settling down might do worse." "A man might," Orville said. "Of course," Ford said, "a man would need to make certain arrangements before making an investment like that." "Certain arrangements," Orville said. "Of a personal nature," Ford said, still not looking up. Orville was quiet for a long moment. "Is this entire town aware of my personal situation?" "This is Dusty Creek," Ford said. 200 people. You and the school teacher have been walking to school together since November." "4 months. It is a small town," Ford said. 4 months is a courtship." Orville looked at the fire in the forge. "I was going to ask her," he said. "I was just working up to it," Ford said. "You have been talking to Pearl." "I have not been talking to Pearl," Ford said. "I just know you." He set down the bellows and looked at his friend. "She is a good woman, Orville, and you are a good man, though you have spent about 2 years trying to convince yourself otherwise. The land is for sale, and the spring is here, and the world does not get better by waiting." Orville thought about that for the rest of the day. He thought about the land north of town, 80 acres with a creek, which he had in fact ridden out to look at on a Sunday in February, telling himself it was just looking, that he was just a man with a free afternoon and no particular investment in property. He thought about the cattle he could raise on 80 acres, not a large operation but a real one, a start. He thought about a house on that land, modest at first, with room to grow. He thought about Pearl at that house, Pearl's cactus in the window, Pearl's books on a shelf he had built solid enough to hold them. He asked her on a Sunday evening in April. He had not planned the exact circumstances. He had for once stopped planning, because planning was what he had been doing for 6 months, and the plans kept failing him at the critical moment. He had simply been walking with her after dinner. The widow Mackey's Sunday dinners had become the weekly anchor of his week, the thing he pointed himself toward, and they had walked past the church and past the school, and to the edge of town where the road went north, and the evening was warm and the sky was enormous and pink in the west. He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. He said, "Pearl." She said, "Yes," with a particular quality of attention that told him she knew something was coming. He said, "I was a man who had decided to be done with things. I had said goodbye to the ranch and the cattle and the horse," and he stopped. "And I had decided that was the end of it, that I was better off not wanting anything that could be lost." She was listening, very still. "Then you stepped off a stage with a trunk that was too heavy for one person to carry," he said. "And I got up before I had decided to. And I have been getting up before I have decided to ever since, because you are the kind of person who makes you do that." He looked at her. The evening light was warm, and she was looking at him with an expression that was open and careful and hoping, all at once. "I do not have much," he said. "I have a job at the smithy and $40 in a tin under my bed. It's more than 40 now. I've been saving. And a piece of land I have not bought yet that I would very much like to buy and build something on. And I have learned in the last 7 months that I am capable of more than I thought I was when I am around you." He took her hand. He looked at her steadily, the way he did all the things in his life that mattered directly, without flinching. "Pearl Hawthorne," he said, "will you marry me?" The evening was very quiet. A bird called somewhere in the brush. The sky was turning from pink to purple in the west. She looked at him for a long moment with those dark, direct eyes, and he could see everything moving through them, everything she had been through, everything she had come to this town to start, everything she had found here that she had not been expecting. He saw the moment she settled. "Yes," she said. He exhaled. He had not realized he was holding his breath until he let it go. She stepped forward and put her arms around him, and he put his arms around her, and they stood at the edge of Dusty Creek in the April evening, holding onto each other. And the bird called again, and the wind moved through the grass, and he thought, with a clarity that had been a long time coming, that the word goodbye had finally, genuinely, been replaced. They were married in June. The wedding was at the church that leaned slightly to the left, which had never bothered either of them. The Reverend, a decent man named Caldwell who had come around to Pearl's teaching methods after some initial reserve, performed the ceremony. The widow Mackey cried, which she would have denied under any questioning. Ford Elkins stood with Orville as his witness and managed to look both pleased and composed throughout. Sheriff Morrison sat in the front row and nodded approvingly at intervals. The Rays children sat in a row, and Tommy Rays, who had become something of a favorite, watched the whole thing with the very serious expression of an 8-year-old who understood that something important was happening. Pearl wore a dress she had made herself of ivory cotton with small flowers embroidered at the collar, which she had embroidered herself over the previous weeks in the evenings, while Orville sat with her in the cottage and read aloud, because they had discovered early that they both liked this, her hands busy and his voice in the quiet room. She wore her hair up with a few small white flowers from the widow Mackey's garden tucked into it, and she was the most beautiful thing Orville had seen, which was not simply because she was objectively lovely, but because she was Pearl, because she was the person who had shown up when he had finished saying goodbye and had, without any announcement, made goodbye irrelevant. He stood at the front of the tilting church and watched her walk down the aisle on Ford Elkins' arm. Ford had volunteered for this when it became clear there was no family to do it, with his characteristic quiet decency, and he thought about all the words he had been unable to find when he needed them, and about how, when it came down to it, the right words had been simple. He thought about the $40. He thought about the stage rolling in on an October morning. He thought about Clara, briefly, warmly, with the particular kind of love that does not compete with present love, but exists alongside it, like the different lights of different seasons. Pearl reached him and they looked at each other, and she was smiling, not her composed public smile but the real one, the one that reached her eyes, and he thought again, "I'm not saying goodbye to this." He said, "I do," with the voice of a man who means every syllable. They bought the 80 acres from Old Reeves in July and spent the late summer and fall of 1879 building. The building was the kind of project that either breaks a marriage in its first year or welds it into something unbreakable, and theirs did the latter. They argued about the placement of the kitchen window with a passion that surprised them both, and Pearl won, and the kitchen window ended up exactly where it needed to be. They disagreed about the size of the barn versus the size of the house, and Orville won, and the barn was large enough to be genuinely useful. They agreed entirely on the porch, which ran the full length of the south side and had 2 chairs that Orville built himself, one slightly taller than the other, and a view of the prairie that was different in every light and never the same twice. Ford Elkins helped with the framing. The Aldrich Ranch hands helped with the heavy timber. Sheriff Morrison, who turned out to be a man of unexpected practical skills, helped with the chimney. The widow Mackey provided so much food over the course of the construction that it became a standing joke that she was the real builder. Tommy Rays and 2 of his school friends came out on a Saturday and carried lumber and were fed by the widow Mackey and went home thoroughly satisfied. Pearl continued teaching through all of it. The school was her anchor and her joy, and the children of Dusty Creek were, she had told Orville many times, the best part of the new place she had come to build. She had 4 new students by fall of 1879, children of families that had moved into the area, and she had begun lobbying the school board for a second reader and an abacus, both of which she got by arguing the case with the same calm competence she had applied to her original hiring. They moved into the house at the end of October, 1879, exactly 1 year after Pearl had stepped off the stage. He carried her across the threshold, which was his idea, and which she pretended to find unnecessary while holding on very tightly. He set her down in the main room of the house, their house, with its kitchen window in the right place and the Longfellow on the shelf he had built in her cactus in a pot by the south-facing glass and his father's old hat on the hook by the door that he had kept through everything. And they stood in the middle of the room and looked at each other, and then looked at the room, and then looked at each other again. "Well," said Pearl. "Well," said Orville. She walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the October prairie, and then she looked at the shelf of books and at the cactus, and she turned back to him and she was crying, which he had almost never seen her do, and he crossed to her and put his arms around her and she said against his chest, "I thought I was coming out here to teach school and be practical and build a sensible life. And instead," he said, "and instead I built this," she said, it is more than I thought I was coming to." He held her and said, "It is more than I thought I was staying for." She laughed through the tears, the real laugh, the surprised one, and pulled back to look at him, and her eyes were bright, and he thought that the man who had stood in this town 1 year ago with $40 and a one-way ticket to El Paso and a very carefully practiced goodbye would not recognize this moment. That man would not have believed this moment was possible for him. He was very glad that man had been wrong. The first cattle came in November of 1879. He bought 12 head from the Aldrich brothers, who were good cattle and solidly priced, and they were the beginning of what would become, over the next several years, a respectable small operation on the 80 acres north of Dusty Creek. He was not building an empire. He was building something that worked, something that lasted, which was what he had always understood ranching to be about, and which he understood now was true of more things than ranching. Pearl came out to see the first cattle arrive and stood at the fence in her coat, her own coat now, a proper one he had ordered from San Antonio as a wedding present, though she still sometimes wore her father's around the house and watched the cattle move into the near pasture with an expression of genuine interest. "They are rather impressive up close," she said. "They are good cattle," he said. "They are very large." "Yes," he said, amused. She leaned on the fence post and watched them and then said, "I shall have to learn about cattle." "You do not have to. I live on a cattle ranch," Pearl said. "Of course I have to learn about cattle." She looked at him. "Tell me about them." He told her about them, and she listened the way she always listened and asked questions the way she always did, and within an hour she had a working knowledge of the 12 head that impressed him considerably, though it did not surprise him, because Pearl's capacity to genuinely absorb information she cared about was one of the things he loved most about her. Loved. He thought the word plainly and without complication. The winter of 1879 passed on the ranch in the way of good winter's hard work and cold mornings, and the warmth of the house in the evenings, and the particular contentment of a life that has structure and meaning. Pearl rode out to the school in town each morning on a gray mare he had found for her, not as fine as his old buckskin, but sound and sweet-tempered and suitable, and Pearl had named her Josephine, which amused him. He spent the days on the ranch, and the evenings with Pearl and the Sundays were still anchored to the widow Mackey's table, which they continued long after there was any practical reason to, because some things become tradition through affection rather than necessity. In the spring of 1880, Pearl told him she was expecting. She told him in the morning early, before the light was fully up, when they were still in that warm half-waking state where conversations sometimes happen before the day's caution has fully assembled itself. She said, "Orville, I believe we are going to have a child." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said very carefully, "You are certain?" "Fairly certain," she said. "I should see Dr. Marsh to confirm." He turned toward her in the early dark, and he could just see the outline of her face, and he said, "Pearl." "Yes." "Yes," she said, and her voice was that careful thing that carries fear under it, not of the news itself, but of how it might be received, of whether the man beside you can hold this too. He said, I did not know I could still want something this much." His voice was rough. He cleared it. "This is wonderful," she exhaled, and he felt it against his shoulder. "I thought so too," she said. "I just was not certain you, Pearl." He took her face in both hands. "I have been afraid for a long time. Of wanting things, of having them taken." He looked at her in the dark. "But I am done being afraid of this, of us, of what we are building." She said nothing for a moment. Then she turned her face and pressed her lips against his palm, briefly, warm. "Good," she said softly, "because I intend to keep building." Dr. Marsh confirmed it in April. The baby would come in October. The pregnancy went well by the standards of the time and the place. Pearl was practical about it, which did not surprise him, and continued teaching through the spring and most of the summer, yielding the classroom only in September to a temporary arrangement with the Reverend's wife, who was educated enough to hold things together for a couple of months. She was not dramatic about the discomforts, but she let him be useful, which he understood as trust. Pearl did not let people be useful to her unless she trusted them. He found himself talking to the baby before it arrived, which he had not planned to do but which happened naturally when he was working in the evenings, and Pearl was sitting near, and the fire was going. He would say things to her stomach, practical things mostly, in the way of a rancher who talks to his work as he does it. The crops were coming in well, the cattle were healthy, the house was sound, all was prepared. Pearl found this endearing, which he could tell because she looked like she was trying not to show it, which was the Pearl equivalent of being visibly moved. The baby came on a Thursday in October, a boy, which was its own kind of symmetry with the October that had begun everything, though he did not say this out loud because he was occupied with being so intensely relieved that Pearl was safe, and the child was healthy that he could not speak intelligibly for several minutes after Dr. Marsh put the baby in his arms. He had a son. He looked at the boy, wrinkled and red and indignant in the particular way of the newly born, and then he looked at Pearl, who was exhausted and bright-eyed and looking at both of them with an expression that was the purest thing he had ever seen on a human face. "He looks like you," Pearl said. "God help him," Orville said, which was not what he had intended to say but made Pearl laugh, and the baby startled at the laugh and made a face, and it was the best sound in the world. They named him James. James Sawyer, for Orville's father, who had built things with bare hands and patience, and who had taught his son that the land and the life will work with you if you treat them well. Pearl said the name suited him, which Orville thought was generous given that James was currently the approximate size and temperament of an angry walnut. The widow Mackey, when she came to see the baby, held him with the practiced ease of a woman who had raised children of her own long ago, and looked at his face with a softness she rarely showed the world, and said to Pearl, "That is a very fine boy." And Pearl said, "He is, isn't he?" with the quiet pride of a woman who has made something good. Ford Elkins held the baby with the extreme caution of a man who works with iron all day and is suddenly holding something infinitely more delicate, and said, almost to himself, "Well, look at that." Tommy Reyes, who came with his mother to pay respects, looked at James from a careful distance and said, "He is very small," and Pearl said, "He will not always be," with the certainty of a schoolteacher who knows that all things grow if you give them what they need. James grew. He was a loud, cheerful, opinionated baby who became a loud, cheerful, opinionated toddler, and then a boy who could walk the fence of the near pasture by age 2, and who knew the names of all 12 of the original cattle. The herd was larger now, with the confidence of a child who has been spoken to seriously about important things since before he could speak back. He had Orville's gray-green eyes and Pearl's directness, and the combination was, according to Ford Elkins, going to be either remarkable or impossible, possibly both. In 1882, in the early spring, Pearl told him again. Same morning, same half-waking conversation, same careful voice. This time there was no fear in it. He pulled her close and said immediately, "Another good thing," and she said against his shoulder, "Yes, another good thing." Their daughter was born in November of 1882, and they named her Clara. He had suggested the name quietly one evening, sitting on the porch in the October warmth before the birth, looking at the prairie, and Pearl had been quiet for a long time and then said, "Yes, I think so too." And he had known that she understood, that she had always understood without jealousy or competition, that there was room in a heart for the people it had held before, that love does not subtract, that honoring the dead does not diminish the living. Clara Sawyer was a different creature from her brother, entirely quiet where he was loud, observant where he was active, given to sitting in corners with objects she was studying with great concentration. She had Pearl's dark hair and Orville's stillness, and Pearl said she was going to be a scientist or a thinker of some kind, and Orville said she was going to be anything she chose, and they agreed on this wholeheartedly. Dusty Creek changed around them as the 1880s moved forward. The railroad came through, not to Dusty Creek itself, but to a town 20 miles east, which changed the nature of the cattle trade and required Orville to think about his operation differently, which he did, with the same practical calm he had learned from his father. Ford Elkins expanded the smithy. Sheriff Morrison retired and a younger man took the office, a capable fellow from Colorado. The school grew, requiring a second teacher, whom Pearl found and hired and supervised with the same competence she brought to everything. The widow Mackey died in the summer of 1883, peacefully in her own bed, and left her house to Pearl, with a note that said, with characteristic directness, that Pearl had been the best boarder she had ever had, and she had no family to leave it to, and she hoped Pearl would put it to good use. Pearl, who had been one of the only people in Dusty Creek who had seen past the widow Mackey's permanent mild suspicion to the fierce and loyal heart beneath it, wept properly for her, and they kept the house, and used it, eventually, as part of the school arrangement when the school needed more space. Pepper, Orville's old red hound, died in the spring of 1883, old and comfortable at the widow's house, where he had gone after Orville sold the first ranch. Orville was told this by the new occupant of the widow's house, and he stood in the street for a moment with his hat in his hands, and Pearl, who was beside him, put her arm through his and said nothing, because she knew when nothing was the right thing. He got a new dog. Pearl named the dog Longfellow, which Orville accepted with only minor protest, and which was soon shortened, by James at age 3, to Fellow, which stuck permanently and suited the dog, who was a brown mutt of indeterminate heritage with great goodwill and only moderate intelligence, and who became within a week the devoted property of both children. The years built on each other, and each one was different and each one was good. There was a drought year in 1884 that hit the cattle hard and required serious decisions, and they made those decisions together at the kitchen table by lamplight, with the books and the ledgers, and they were frightening decisions, but they were made with both of them present, and it made a difference. The way things made a difference when you were not facing them alone. They came through it. The herd was smaller after, but it was sound. There was a winter in 1885 that was so cold the pipes froze, and they spent 2 weeks with the children in front of the main fireplace, and it was miserable and funny in equal measure. And James, who was 5, became fascinated by ice and staged multiple experiments involving the kitchen bucket. And Clara, who was 3, learned to say the word crystallization with perfect accuracy, which Pearl declared was proof of her theory about Clara's future in science. Pearl taught and taught and taught. By 1886, she had been teaching in Dusty Creek for 8 years and had had a hand in the education of nearly every child in the county, and she was known through the region as the woman who had shown up to a bad situation and made something of it, which was true, and which she would have denied modestly if you told her so directly. He loved watching her teach. He would sometimes ride into town on a pretext and pass the school and hear her voice through the open window in the warm months, clear and authoritative and occasionally very funny, because Pearl had learned that children learn better when they laugh, and he would stop for a moment outside and just listen. He had not stopped marveling at her. This was something he had not expected, that it would not wear down the marveling. He had thought perhaps that familiarity would sand it away, that the woman he had known for a month or a year would become, over time, simply the woman he knew, familiar as furniture. But Pearl was not like that. She kept surprising him, new thoughts, new positions, new capacities he had not seen before. She had opinions about the cattle business that were sharper than he initially credited, and she was right about them often enough that he had stopped being surprised when she was. She had read, by the mid-1880s, more books than he had known existed in West Texas, and she talked about them with a pleasure that was contagious. She was, at 34, more herself than she had been at 26, and he had loved her at 26. He told her this once, sitting on the porch in the summer evening, the children asleep inside, the prairie dark and enormous around them, and the stars as thick as they had always been. She looked at him for a long moment. "You are going to make me cry on the porch," she said. "I will allow it," he said. She shook her head, but she was smiling, and then she looked out at the prairie and she said, "I think when I came here I thought I was starting over, that everything before was finished and I was building from nothing. And now I think the before was not wasted. Every bit of it made me who I came here as." She looked at him, "including the hard parts, including the lonely parts." "The lonely parts gave you practice," he said. "For what?" "For being in a place where you knew nobody and having to make something of it," he said. "You were very good at it." "I was terrified," she said. "You were," he said, "and you squared your shoulders anyway. I watched you do it from across the street." She was quiet for a moment. "You noticed that?" "I noticed everything," he said. "I was just not ready to know that I had." She leaned over and put her head on his shoulder, the way she had on the stage to Sweetwater, and he put his arm around her, and they sat on the porch in the summer dark with the cicadas going and the cattle somewhere in the near distance, and the children asleep inside and Fellow the dog a warm presence at their feet. "Orville," she said. "Yes, I am glad you did not get on that stage to El Paso." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the stars. "So am I," he said, "every day." The stage to El Paso, which he had put a ticket in his pocket for and then unpocketed and turned into something else. A conversation, a trunk carried across a street, a fixed latch, a pot of coffee, a long walk, a hand held by a fire, a name said at the right moment, an 80-acre piece of land with a creek on the east side, a house with a kitchen window in the right place. A boy named James and a girl named Clara and a dog named Fellow, and a life that had been built piece by piece out of the rubble of everything he had said goodbye to. He thought about the goodbyes. He had said them, all of them, and they had all been necessary, every single one, because a man who has said goodbye to everything has made room for everything new, even if he does not know that when he is doing it. He had not known it standing in the October street. He had thought he was empty. He had, in fact, been ready. Pearl had shown up, and she had shown up in the particular way of things that were always meant to arrive, not with a fanfare, but with a trunk that was too heavy for one person and an expression of controlled composure and a laugh that surprised itself. And he had gotten up from his bench before he had decided to, because some things you respond to before your caution can intervene. James grew into a boy of 7 with his father's steadiness and his mother's curiosity and the particular gift of neither parent, which was an ability to charm every adult in Dusty Creek into giving him small amounts of candy and extra information by the simple method of asking very sincere questions. Pearl observed this with the professional eye of a schoolteacher and said it was either going to make him a very good lawyer or a very good confidence man, and that the difference was mostly direction. Clara at 5 was beginning to read with the voracious, focused determination of someone who has found the tool they have been looking for without knowing what they were looking for, and Pearl was quietly, radiantly delighted by this. Orville would come in from the evening chores to find the two of them at the kitchen table with a book, Clara's small finger tracing the lines with concentration, Pearl's voice quiet and encouraging, and he would stand in the doorway for a moment and let himself have the moment completely before going in. In the autumn of 1887, when James was 7 and Clara was 4 and the ranch was sound, and the cattle were the best they had been in 3 years and Dusty Creek had grown enough to have a second saloon and a proper hotel, Pearl came to him on a Sunday evening with an expression he had learned over 9 years of marriage to mean that she had been thinking about something for a while and had arrived at a position. He said, "What is it?" she said. "I want to build the school a proper library. Not just a shelf of books, a real room with a real collection." She paused. "I have been in contact with a book merchant in San Antonio who is willing to sell a first collection at a reasonable price if we can raise the funds, and I believe we can raise the funds from the community if the approach is right." He looked at her. "You have a plan." "I have a very detailed plan," she said. "Do you need my help, or are you going to just go ahead and do it?" "I would like your help," she said. "Specifically your help talking to the Aldrich brothers because they have money and they like you." "They tolerate me," he said. "They like your children." "Then we bring James," she said, and the corner of her mouth turned up. He laughed. He could not help it. "All right," he said. "We bring James." The library happened in 1888. Pearl organized the fundraising campaign with the same quiet competence that had organized everything else. She talked to families. She talked to ranchers. She held a community supper that raised a remarkable amount of money in a single evening, partly because the widow Mackey's kitchen tradition had been passed on to Mrs. Ray's, who could cook with a generosity that made people feel the good they were doing in the world. She wrote to the book merchant in San Antonio. She organized the renovation of the corner room of the school building. The Aldrich brothers gave $50 each, which was James's contribution in the technical sense, since he had spent 2 visits to their ranch being thoroughly charming and mentioning the library project with the winsome gravity of a 7-year-old who has been well coached. The library opened in the spring of 1888, in a ceremony at the school that most of Dusty Creek attended, and that Pearl accepted recognition for with the particular grace of someone who is genuinely more interested in the thing than in the credit for it. She said, in the short speech she gave short because she was a school teacher and believed in economy of language, that the library was for the children of Dusty Creek and for any child who came after them, because a town that taught its children to love reading was a town that was building something that lasted. Orville, standing at the back of the room again as was his habit, thought about longevity, about things that lasted, about the 64 head of cattle on 80 acres with a creek, and the house with the kitchen window in the right place, and the boy and the girl and the dog, and the woman at the front of the room who had arrived with $12.30, and a letter of employment that turned out to be worthless and had built, from those materials and the ones she found here, something that would stand after both of them were gone. He thought about the stage in October of 1878. He thought about how he had looked up before he had meant to. He thought about the practiced goodbye that had been waiting in his pocket, ready to deploy, the way a man carries a knife, not for specific use but out of general habit, and about how it had become, over the years, gradually and entirely unnecessary, so that he could no longer find it when he looked for it, and did not want to. After the ceremony in the warm spring evening, walking back to the wagon with Pearl beside him and James telling Clara at length about what each section of the library contained, and Clara listening with her characteristic silent focus, Orville reached over and took Pearl's hand. She looked at him. "You did a fine thing today," he said. "We did," she said. "You did the important parts. You talked to the Aldrich brothers. James talked to the Aldrich brothers." She laughed, the real one, the warm, sudden, surprised one, that was exactly the same as it had been in October of 1878, and that he would never, for as long as he lived, stop being glad to hear. She laughed and she held his hand, and they walked through the spring evening of Dusty Creek toward the wagon that would take them home. And James said something to Clara that made Clara say, "Crystallization," very seriously, and Pearl laughed again, and Orville thought, "I have everything. I have everything there is." He had been a man who had said goodbye to every good thing in his life, and he had stood in a street with a ticket in his pocket and the practiced words of another goodbye ready on his tongue. And she had stepped off a stage with dark hair coming loose from its pins and a trunk too heavy for one person, and an expression that was composure over something fragile, and he had gotten to his feet before he had decided to. He had not been able to find the practiced words. He had never found them again. And the empty place where they had been had filled over the years with things that were better than goodbye, with names, Pearl and James and Clara, with the sound of a laugh, with the smell of morning on cattle country, with the weight of a good book on a well-built shelf, with coffee without sugar, with gloves stitched with care, with the particular warmth of a person who sees you clearly and stays. He had thought once that goodbye was the only word he knew how to say with any real conviction. He knew now that it was not. He knew now that there were other words he said with more conviction, words that did not end things but began them and continued them, and built them into something the world could not easily take, because they were woven through with the kind of love that survives droughts and fevers and doubts and hard winters, and all the ordinary, extraordinary difficulty of a life lived fully. He knew now that the best word, the word with the most weight, the word he would go on saying for the rest of his life to the woman beside him and the children ahead of him and the land around him and the morning that came every day regardless, was yes. Yes, still here, still wanting this, still grateful. On a Tuesday evening in the late spring of 1888, Orville Sawyer sat on the south porch of his house on 80 acres north of Dusty Creek, Texas, with Pearl beside him and James attempting to teach Fellow a trick that Fellow was too good-natured and too dim to learn, and Clara sitting on the porch step with a book, and the cattle were quiet in the near pasture, and the sky was going pink and gold. And he thought that a man who had once stood in a street having run out of things to say goodbye to could not have imagined this, and was very glad he had been wrong. Pearl was looking at the sky, the way she did some evenings, reading it, almost the way she read books, with full attention. She did this when she was thinking. He waited, comfortable in the waiting, because he had learned over 9 years that Pearl's thinking was always worth what it cost. She said, "Orville." "Yes," he said. "I think—" She paused. She looked at him with those dark, direct eyes that had measured him across a dusty street in October a decade ago and had not stopped seeing him clearly since. "I think we should get a second dog. Fellow is overworked." He looked at Fellow, who was lying on his back with all 4 feet in the air, while James sat on the ground beside him, and Clara read unperturbed. "Fellow," he said, "is underworked in every conceivable way." "He has 2 children and a cattle ranch," Pearl said. "I am on his side." "You are always on the dog's side." "I am on the side of whoever needs support," she said, with her composure perfectly intact and her eyes doing what they did when she was amused. "It is a professional habit." He looked at her. He looked at the pink sky and the pasture and the children and the dog and the house behind him with its kitchen window and its good solid shelves. "All right," he said. "We can get another dog." She smiled. Not the polite smile and not the professional smile, the real one, the one that had been there since that first surprising laugh in October of a year he would always mark as the year his life changed direction without his permission, and toward something better than anything he could have planned. "Good," she said, and leaned her head against his shoulder, and the evening held them, and everything was exactly as it should be.